Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Heart to Heart series today. We're going to be talking about second chances and education and Pell education. Um, so I wanted to take a moment and introduce everyone who's on our panel today. Joshua Mitman is our Director of Federal Affairs at Director of Federal Legislative Affairs at FAMM. Gerald Tarboro is one of our many FAMM advocates who's been working with us for a minute, and we are excited to have him. And then there's also Heather Rice-Minus, who is the Vice President of Advocacy and Church Mobilization at Prison Fellowship. Welcome. So what are we talking about today? We're talking about the importance of education and access to education in prisons. Many years ago, we used to allow Pell grants in prisons. It allowed people who are in prison to actually get a college education and be funded in order to get that education. Some years back, that provision was rescinded. And Josh is going to give us a little bit of background on that entire process. But overall, we know that if we want to increase second chances, if we want people to get out and have a viable way of reintegrating into society, we've got to give them opportunities, and we've got to give them a way to integrate themselves into society. And we've got to provide opportunities in prison and outside of prison. And Pell Grant is one of those ways. So I want to kick it to Josh to talk a little bit about Pell Grant restoration, what's going on now, and why are we here today?
Sure. So thanks, Rabiah. I'll start off with just a little bit of history about the Pell Grant program in general and sort of how that impacts people who are in prison. So the Pell Grant program was created in 1965. It was created to provide basic financial aid to people who are seeking college degrees, and it's based on your financial need, right? So people who have greater financial resources to begin with would get less financial aid from the Pell Grant program. People who have a greater financial need would and do get more financial aid from the Pell Grant program. Initially, and for decades, people in prison were not excluded. So what that meant was that there were college programs for people in prison all across the country. In 1990, there were 350 college programs in prisons. So that people in those prisons could take college classes, get a college degree, and they were able to do so with significant financial aid from the Pell Grant program. Now, in 1994, as part of the Tough on Crime 94 crime bill, people in prison were excluded from receiving Pell Grants. And so the problem that created is not just that, oh, okay, now I as an individual, if I'm in prison, I don't personally get the Pell Grant financial aid, but the college programs still exist. What it actually means is that, so few people then had the financial means to pay for college programs that college programs just started disappearing all over the place. So, if in any given prison, if there are only a small handful of people who can afford it without Pell Grants, without assistance from the Pell Grant program, the college program is going to cease to exist. So what that meant is, I said there were 350 college programs in 1990 in prisons. In 2005, there were 12 college programs. So it's not just, this exclusion doesn't just impact individuals on that basis. It eliminates college programs kind of in the broad sense as well. In recent history, there's been President Obama introduced a second chance Pell pilot program. So it introduced sort of these individualized programs for specific colleges and some specific prisons to sort of test out, what this would look like today if we were to restore Pell Grant opportunities for people in prisons. President Trump expanded that program, so now there are college programs in a little more than 100 prisons across the country, but it's on a much smaller scale. And then there's some legislation proposing to just remove this exemption altogether, to return us to the pre-1994 state where people in prison have access to these Pell Grant financial aid services, resources. And, like I said, what that would mean is that college programs as a whole would return to the inside of prisons for everyone.
So I want to talk to Gerald. Gerald, when you were in prison, what were the educational opportunities for you, and specifically with getting getting a college education? What if you were to? What would that look like? How important is it to have education in prisons? Like, if you can just give us a kind of like, I don't want to say a day in a life, but what are we actually talking about? What is it in practice for someone who is currently incarcerated to have access to opportunities?
It's imperative. I can't even describe to you how much of a hunger for knowledge is there. I would see it on a daily basis. So I worked in the education department. I was a tutor when I was in the penitentiary in Hazleton, which is a very difficult place to be doing time. And I was a tutor when I went to FCI Cumberland, which is a medium. It's hard to describe. We tried so many different things. We tried to bring so many different programs, especially when I was in Cumberland. We tried to get Bowie State. There were a few different colleges that were around Cumberland, Maryland, that were willing to come in and teach. But we met so much resistance from, I'm not going to say all of the administration, but some of the administration. It was like we met a roadblock at every point. It was always something. And I couldn't, for the life of me, figure out why you would not want to educate these guys. I'm trying to think of the best way to describe what it's like on the inside there, but people do want to rehabilitate themselves in prison. This is.
So Gerald, if I wanted to take a class, what was afforded to you? What was there for you guys? We know, as you said, Bowie State tried to come in, and different people tried to come in, but as of the last time you were there, what was that like trying to learn?
So it was, everybody would ask me questions about FAFSA forms, or, what can I do for a correspondence course? And I would try to tell them, all right, listen, I don't know all of the answers, but I'm gonna figure it out. And so I would go do my research. And what I figured out, that there were only 6 colleges that actually did a full correspondence course, paper and pencil. And when I say paper and pencil, you have to understand where we are. We're inside of a prison. We don't have computer access like a lot of the correspondence courses require. So there were there were 5, because the 6th one, the last semester, you had to take online. So I would reach out to these people like, okay, what could we do to bring more access to your program, to this prison? And it was very tough. It was like they didn't have the answers that I needed, and I would have to go to the reentry coordinator, and it was just it was an uphill battle. So the other thing was the expense. To do a correspondence course, each class was about, at one of the places was about $1,200. And to be in prison and to shell out that amount of money. And I know a few people that did it. They worked in the Unicor, and they paid for these classes with the money that they earned in the federal prison industries, the factory that are at a lot of these federal prisons. So that alone should tell you just how hungry for knowledge people are, that they're working their entire day just to educate themselves, because these correspondence courses do cost a significant amount of money. So in saying that, these Pell Grants will help tremendously to allow people to afford to educate themselves. And like I said, the desire to educate, the hunger for knowledge is very real in a lot of these places. I can attest to that. I've seen it every day. I was a tutor from 7:30 in the morning till 8:30 at night. I lived, eat, this is what I did every single day. So
Mhm.
yeah, I can attest to it.
Heather, can you talk about your work at Prison Fellowship and how it plays into Pell restoration and why it's so important for your organization to be involved in this?
Sure. Thank you for having me today. It's always good to be with our partners at FAMM. Love the work you all do. Gerald, thank you for sharing your story. I love that theme again and again. You were saying a hunger for knowledge. And at Prison Fellowship, we're the nation's largest Christian nonprofit serving people in prison, their families, and those coming home. We advocate for justice reform because of our faith values. And so for us, we're running programs inside of prison. We have a program called the Academy that walks men and women through a character building. All sorts of practical life skills are taught there, like finances and parenting, addiction recovery, and those kinds of things. But we're so grateful for programs that exist, particularly education programs, which we know have a dramatic effect on reducing recidivism and just giving people hope and charting a new life path for them. In our Academy program, we see people see a different vision for themselves and see so much transformation happen in the course of those programs happening. And we know the same is true for when people get to experience particularly higher education inside of prisons. And so our federal agenda at Prison Fellowship, we've been partnering with FAMM and others to restore Pell Grants, because we know that so many people in prison, as Gerald was talking about, can't afford to put themselves through higher education opportunities available in prison. And we know when the finances are there, the expansion of those programs happens. And so we want to see Pell Grant access restored. We believe that we should be giving people who are incarcerated every opportunity to use that time effectively and to become good citizens inside the walls. We know that there's this amazing cultural shift that can happen inside of prisons. I don't know if y'all have watched College Behind Bars, which just as Gerald's attesting to his personal experience, you can get a taste of that watching that documentary that walks through how a prison and how the men in these programs and women in these programs, their lives change and their trajectory changes as a result of higher education. I think that was on PBS. It's really powerful. And so that's become our number one federal priority, is to push for Congress to not only, see the benefits of the Second Chance Pell pilot that Josh talked about, that has continued from the Obama administration into the Trump administration and expanded, which is wonderful, but we really want to remove that ban on incarcerated students from accessing Pell. And we know when that happens, that anyone who has that thirst for knowledge is going to be able to access Pell Grants, who qualifies for them. And we're going to see an expansion of those programs. And as a result, we're going to see stronger communities inside of prison, and we're going to see people more prepared to come home and to access jobs and provide for their families and contribute.
Absolutely. Great work. So we have a question from the audience or people who are watching. So the question is really around why can't there be scholarships? Why can't there be what's the barriers to families paying for college for people who are incarcerated? If you want education, basically, why isn't there more opportunities in those veins as opposed to Pell restoration?
So I think right now what we have today available are those alternatives. There are certainly some families who do, support their loved one who's incarcerated to go to school. But we know a lot of the population in prison are at an economic disadvantage. And if that loved one who's in prison right now was not in prison and was trying to get a Pell Grant, it would be available to them because of that economic disadvantage. And so merely because they are in prison, they are barred from that same opportunity, which is really a disadvantage to society as a whole, because we know that people who have access to higher education in prison are going to be more prepared to not make new victims when they get out. They're going to have a better prison culture as a result of that happening. And so it's not to say that those other sources of funds, whether from families or as Gerald said, some people are so hungry that they're working and making very small amounts of money working a prison job, and they're putting that all towards correspondence class in prison. So I think people really are trying to pull together whatever funds they can. There are some very limited philanthropic dollars in this space that fund certain programs. But the reality is it just doesn't meet the demand. And so that is why we have to have a restoration of Pell Grant access for incarcerated students, in my view.
Josh, can you talk a little bit about where we are in the process of getting Pell restored? Just like how can people get involved? Where are we, and where should people be paying attention? What should people be paying attention to right now?
Sure. So, after within the last couple of years, there have been a few bills introduced that have either explicitly called for restoration of Pell Grant access to people in prison, or otherwise that's been a key part of the negotiations of those bills. So the Higher Education Act reauthorization negotiations over the last couple of years, both in the House and in the Senate, this has been a key part of that. In both chambers, the REAL Act in the Senate, introduced by Senators Schatz, Lee, and Durbin, is a bipartisan bill. This is key legislation that would restore Pell Grant access. But most significantly right now, the House of Representatives voted in the end of July, I think, the very end of July. They voted on their really broad appropriations bill for the coming year, for the coming financial year. And a part of that was a restoration of Pell Grant access to people in prison. This is with no exclusions, with no restrictions. And so now that's passed the House of Representatives, and the Senate has to pass an appropriations bill as well this fall. In theory, the deadline is the end of this month. They can do some things to sort of push that off, but one way or another, they have to pass an appropriations bill, essentially a budget for the next financial year. So right now, I think the biggest source of focus has to be on encouraging the Senate to include that same provision to restore Pell Grant access in their appropriations bill. That provision is already passed in the House of Representatives, so if it passes in the Senate as well in their appropriations, we can move forward. We can get it to the president's desk, where I think it would have a very good chance of passing.
For the naysayers who would say, why should we pay for this? Can someone speak to how Pell actually works? Because I've heard from various folks during my time here at FAMM and elsewhere that Pell is not necessarily contingent on taxpayer dollars in the same way. I may be mistaken in that. But Josh or Heather, whichever, could you speak to that?
Yeah, so essentially when you apply, if you for a Pell Grant as any student, as Josh mentioned in the beginning, it's going to be based on your economic standing. So they look at your ability for your family to contribute, and that's really what drives what will make you eligible for a Pell Grant, is your expected family contribution and the cost of attendance. And so that's how you get that. Now, there has been some debate over the past, and I think kind of some myths around whether or not, increasing eligibility to incarcerated students would increase the budget for Pell Grants. The reality is right now, there is a surplus of Pell Grant dollars available for Pell Grants. And so if we, increased access to Pell Grants for incarcerated students, we could use some of that surplus to go towards this. And I think another really important point that has been sort of a myth, even with, in 1994, when Pell Grant access to incarcerated students was removed, is people really felt like, well, if we give Pell Grants to an incarcerated students, it's going to take away from a non-incarcerated student. And just like other programs where it's really just based on a simple equation and eligibility access, that's just not the way it works. It's not sort of a balloon where we only can fit so much. If you qualify for this program, you will get it. And every year, Congress has to predict how many eligible people will access Pell and adjust accordingly. And so just because an incarcerated student applies doesn't mean someone who otherwise is eligible based on their family contribution and the cost of attendance at school who's not incarcerated, they're still going to also be eligible. Josh, is there anything else I missed there that you want to add?
That was exactly what I was going to say. The only thing I would add is just, when you look to, as further evidence at this point, when you look to 1994, 1995, when there was this big decrease in the number of people in prison who had access to college programming and people were excluded from receiving these Pell Grants, the number of students outside of prison who were eligible for Pell didn't change. So it's not, we didn't see, fewer people in prison get Pell Grants, so more people outside will get Pell Grants. It didn't change at all. So that's just, we have no reason to think it would work the other way in reverse. If we were to restore Pell Grants to people in prison, there's no reason to think that would decrease the number of people eligible outside of prison. It's like Heather said, it's not a balloon where we can only fit a certain number of people. It's not like a zero-sum game in that way.
Right. I was just checking like the latest numbers too. I think FY20's projection was an $8 billion surplus in Pell Grants. And so, that those dollars are invariably going to be used either to, increase Pell Grant awards, or could be used if we choose to expand eligibility to incarcerated students.
Gerald, can you talk a little bit about how important education is into reentry and coming back out and actually being able to use that on the outside? From your perspective, how important is it to have access to education when it comes to coming back home?
It's paramount. So I used to always tell them in my GED class that getting a GED is just like you getting an address. It's not even getting your foot in the door. If you can learn a trade or get a degree, some type of certification, you will now have the ability to go out and to so many more doors will be open for you. So I would encourage them to take it further. Like, don't just stop at a GED. Try to get a certificate. Try to learn how to learn about carpentry, learn about welding, learn anything you possibly can, because the more that you know, the more marketable you are for when you get home. So that way, you can't only say, okay, well, I just got a GED. Somebody's going to look at you, well, what else do you know how to do? So I try to be practical in my advice to guys coming home, myself included. I had a college degree, but I still had to learn as many things as I possibly could, because I wanted as many avenues available to me that I possibly could have. I knew I had done a lot of time in federal prison, and I knew that I was going to need some other things under my belt. So I learned how to weld. I learned welding, like what I do now. I'm a welder and I'm a millwright. So I did not know what avenue I was going to take, but I knew I was going to be doing something. I knew that I wasn't going back to the life that I knew, being in the drug trade. It has a very short shelf life. And I tell people that all the time. Don't expect, there's two sides to the coin. There may be good things. No, there's nothing good about that life. I'm sorry. I was about to say something that was not true. There's a flip side to the coin. And a lot of these young guys need to understand that. And I can speak to it. Like, I lived that life. So I can speak to it. And I think a lot of the younger kids that were in my class can respect that, because they knew that what I was saying to them, I was speaking real life to them. You can't go out there and expect, you keep saying to me, I would have a lot of the younger guys, a lot of the guys would tell me, like, I want to go and open my own business. I would say, okay, well, what would be the first thing that you would do? When you want to open your own business, what do you do? And They couldn't tell me about federal tax ID numbers. They couldn't tell me about credit. They didn't know what a Dun and Bradstreet was. So I said, all right, well, you know, what's your next step? What are you going to do? You can't leave out of this classroom and say, oh, well, nobody told me. I'm telling you. So now you go ahead and, you know, figure it out. And I'm always here for you, but I'm only going to meet you halfway. I'm not going to come 90 for you to give me 10. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. Absolutely. We do have a question from the audience for you again, Gerald. How does education improve attitudes in prison? So what I mean by that is, how does it change the quality of life for people who are in, if you are taking classes, if you're involved in things that, you know, that are educational programming, for example, how does it change the quality of life there for the individual and even the prison at large, if you know?
So the best example I could give you is this. So I was in USP Hazleton, which is in Brewster Mills, West Virginia, and it's a very violent place. I don't know how else to say it, but it was extremely violent. What they did was they had, I'm trying to remember the name of the college. They had these college certificates that we could earn, business etiquette. It was all centered around business. So we would go to the visitation room, and a professor, an actual professor from this college, what was it? I can't remember the name. They would come in and teach us a class. The first one was business etiquette. I remember that distinctly. But they told us, you cannot get in any type of trouble, have no write-ups, no infractions, anything in order to be in this program. So what that did was, it made everybody that was in this particular program stop and think about whatever they had going on. But also they would tell their buddies, like, listen, you know, I got this thing, I'm trying to really change my life and trying to do some things. They would also encourage them to come in, but they would tell them, like, listen, if you have something going on, at least let us get through this class. We, you know, we got the books, we got the course going on. So it changed. I think that it changed a lot of guys' attitude, because they had the ability to see that people actually cared to come in and want to teach this class and want to teach them some viable, like some things that were viable in the world. And it made them feel like they mattered. I know that that's what I felt. I can speak to myself and my cellmate, because we used to talk about it all the time. It makes you feel like you were alive again, because, you know, when you are somewhere on the top of a mountain in West Virginia somewhere, like you feel like you feel like you don't exist, so to speak. So this made us feel, it gave us a sense of normalcy is what it did, especially for me. So I think that's part of the answer. I would have to think about it some more.
That's cool.
Rabiah, if I could also just, I think to piggyback on that, the other piece, I think there's such this powerful transformation that happens with those who are incarcerated who participate in these programs. But I think what's really interesting about Pell Grant restoration is also the support from the corrections community. So the Correctional Leaders Association has endorsed the REAL Act and is pushing for Pell Grant restoration. I've had the opportunity to actually go and tour with some members of Congress, and was hosted by Commissioner Rob Carter in Indiana to see one of their Pell Grant sites. We did a press conference on Pell Grant restoration and had Director Frakes who's the Department of Corrections head of Nebraska out. There's just such support from those who are in leadership positions and those who are working at the front lines of corrections for this, because they see the positive impact it's having on the men and women in prison, and it's changing the culture. And so that means their jobs are better, right? And there's a better culture when you're not having to deal with as much violence or hopelessness for those that you're charged with caring for, and they actually have purpose. And so I think it's really exciting to see not only the transformation that's happening among those who are getting to participate in the programs, but for those in corrections to see the support that's come out for this legislation.
Absolutely. So let's talk about some of the barriers to passing legislation and getting Pell Grants restored in prisons. Can you guys talk about some of the barriers that we've had over time and some of the barriers that are current today that persist?
Sure. So, Heather spoke earlier about some of the barriers, some of the pushback you get is this misconception that if people in prison can get Pell Grants, then that takes grants from students who are outside of prison. But there's also, one of the big issues we deal with now is this issue of exclusions. And you see this almost any criminal justice bill today. This is going to be part of the discussion. A lot of the proposals recently have been, oh, well, we'll restore Pell Grants to people who are incarcerated, but we need to exclude people who are serving life sentences, or we need to exclude people with this conviction or that conviction. And so, that's a big challenge because, of course, we think there shouldn't be these exclusions. And I think it's, that comes from sort of a moral reasoning. We think that access to education is kind of one of these fundamental aspects of human dignity that should be accessible to anyone who's in prison. But on top of that, I think there are also kind of more tangible reasons to push back against these exclusions. So, there's a slippery slope element to it where once you start talking about excluding people who have one sentence or one conviction, then it's easy for somebody else to jump on and say, oh, well, if we're excluding people with, a murder conviction, why don't we exclude people with this conviction too? And, once you start to kind of accept exclusions on one basis, it can escalate on that basis. But I think one of the other aspects of this that, we hear a lot that people who are serving life sentences or otherwise serving long sentences are real mentors and leaders within prison communities. So they're often the ones who act as mentors, direct other prisoners to educational resources, act as kind of leaders within their cohorts. And we think that if they're going to be serving that role, people serving life sentences or other long sentences are going to be serving that role, we want to equip them to do that as best that they can. And the best way to do that is, or an easy, straightforward way to do that is to give them access to these college programs as well. There's no reason why these people in particular who are going to be in leadership positions like that would be excluded.
Mm-hmm. So on the topic of exclusions, Gerald, I really want to ask you, having served time with people who have had tremendously long sentences, and you having a long sentence, that's long to me. So having had a long sentence, what is the importance of being able to access education, particularly for people who are spending longer time in prison? I know that there are certain programs, or that we've been told that there's certain programs that you can't even get access to until you're close to getting out or something like that. But what is the benefit of having access to education and other types of programming, particularly when you may have a life sentence or some other situation that where you won't be coming home for a while?
So you have to give people hope. I spent a great deal of time with people that I'm still close to that have, my one buddy has 85 years. He came in to a United States penitentiary 85 years. I can't express to you just how tough that is to be doing that amount of time and have nothing to look forward to. So this gives people the ability to have things to look forward to talk to their children about. If you can educate yourself, you can pass that along to your kids and have that cycle continue. I mean, this is what it's all about. You don't want to just warehouse somebody for that amount of time for a life sentence and just give them, a TV or, to placate somebody. Let them listen to MP3. They have MP3s now. These people want to educate themselves. They want to better themselves. Some people want to learn how to read so they can fight their case. So so many things come to my mind, so many examples of people that I care for that have life sentences. And it's not a question that I would even ask, like, why do you want to, your brain never shuts off. You always want to be doing something positive, moving in a positive direction, even if you do have a life sentence. Your outlook on life is more positive you have something to look forward to. That way you're not wasting time focusing on trivial things. And that's when the violence starts. That's when the petty politics start, when you're not focused on nothing but jail stuff, jail politics. When you have a focus in a direction, it benefits the prisons, it makes them safer, and it benefits people that are, gonna return to society, because a lot of influence comes from lifers, from what I've seen. A lot of these younger guys respect and listen to these lifers. So if they're telling them, listen, you need to go educate yourself, you need to figure out a way forward. This is what I'm doing, and let me show you what I have going on. That influence is tremendous. It's I can't even put it into words. I've seen it many times. I wish. No, you know what? I'll leave it there, because I was going to mention a buddy of mine, but I like to ask them first before I put their name out there. I like to ask them, and I haven't had a chance to speak to them, but there's somebody that has a tremendous influence on a lot of young kids out of Washington, D.C. I will say that he's revered, and I have so much respect for him. And all he used to stress to these young guys was getting their GEDs. To get with me, he would always push them in my direction. Like, listen, I'm teaching credit. I'm teaching about credit. I'm teaching about how to fill out a FAFSA form. He would always push them in my direction. And he has life. He has life plus. And I love him for doing that.
Okay, so one of the things I want to throw out, I know some of the questions may seem like a little bit basic in terms of like why would somebody want to educate themselves in prison if they're spending life in prison? But I think that for people on the outside, they have no idea, they have no clue. To them, they not just that they don't have any clue, because they have never been presented with the idea of staying, I'm just gonna say it, in a cage for the duration of their life, what they would do at that time, that they don't even think about it. So your insight is very helpful on that, and making sure that people understand the bigger picture about what's actually going on, and the practical application of the bills and laws that we pass in real time. So thank you for that. So I wanted to throw another question out there. So a lot of times we do these lives, and we get a lot of questions from our viewers, and also people who are very involved with FAMM, to say, well, how does this impact the states? Because a lot of our work is, we do federal work, we also do state work, but a lot of the emphasis can be a lot of times on the federal work. So how does Pell restoration impact the states? And either Heather or Josh can take that question.
Sure. So I think one of the most exciting things about working on Pell Grant restoration at the federal level, because at Prison Fellowship, we have a agenda that always is focused on the federal level, but also has some target states. And I think the fun part about this reform, which is really picking up steam, is that it has the ability to impact not only federal prisons, but also state prisons. Because this is a federal grant program, these dollars are actually going to be available to state departments of corrections as well as federal prisons if the Pell Grant ban was lifted. So this has a nationwide impact, state and federal, which is really exciting. And, to Josh's point of earlier about some of the barriers we're facing, I think another just note of hope I want to give those who are listening into this is we have started seeing bipartisan support for this legislation for the first time in many years. The REAL Act, which Josh mentioned, had been introduced session after session after session with only Democrats on the bill. And we've been seeing a growing number of Republicans who have come onto the bill and supported it. We've seen the Trump administration expand the second chance Pell sites. And so while there still remains, some division on various criminal justice topics, I think criminal justice as a whole is one of the bipartisan issues of our day, fortunately, and especially education in prison is one where we can find a lot of bipartisan support, because even if people feel differently about sentencing, if you will, I think the idea that we want to prepare people in prison as best as possible to live as good citizens, in prison, to transform their lives, is something that resonates, across the aisle. So, just a note of hope that we've been seeing this growing momentum on this particular issue as well.
Yeah, I think this is one of the few issues where you'd see support from both, Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, as well as you know, Democrats on the far left. I think is one of the few issues you'd see agreement kind of just widely across the spectrum. Um, there are people, this is totally bipartisan or almost, it's a nonpartisan issue, I think. Um, so I totally, yeah, want to emphasize that as well. And yeah, I want to reiterate too, I'm excited, my work is always focused on federal work, and it is really exciting for me to work on something that's, the legislation is all federal, but the impact can impact people in federal prisons, state prisons, all across the country. So that's really exciting, and I'm sure that's exciting for a lot of, a lot of the FAMM members who have loved ones in state prisons who, do see a lot of federal work get pushed forward. This is going to be, I think, an exciting thing for them to see something in the U.S. Congress that could impact them as well.
And so this is one of the few, well, a lot of the criminal justice bills intersect with other sectors like education, but this one in particular, how has the support been from the education community? Is this something that they are pushing as well as us, or is it mostly from the criminal justice end? And can anybody talk about that?
Sorry, I wasn't sure if Josh was trying to get off. I thought he was starting. My apologies.
Sorry, the question froze for a second, so I didn't quite catch
it. Was just about the support of the education community, and Josh, feel free to jump in. I mean, I think this has been interesting for me because I've worked as a lobbyist at the federal level on criminal justice reform for over a decade, and I usually focus on the Judiciary Committee. My partners tend to be criminal justice organizations, maybe law enforcement, faith organizations, of course. And so this has been a whole new world to actually work in partnership with a lot of, leading education organizations who, yes, I would say do definitely care about this and are at the forefront of, informing the coalition of groups working on this from an education perspective. Would you agree with that, Josh?
Yes, totally. I'm trying to pull up the list of Real Act endorsements, but I mean, and it's not just it's the criminal justice community, it's the educational community, but there's also been a lot of support from like the business community as well. So we've seen real support from. I'm trying to find an example, but okay, well here's the list of Real Act endorsers. We've got a lot of correctional agencies, but there's the American Council on Education, Association of American Colleges and Universities, National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities. I mean, and that's just one of many educational organizations that are in strong support of this as well. So it's an interesting. I mean, like Heather said, it's nice. It's exciting to see an issue where there is so much overlap and where, I get to work on an issue that's different from something otherwise might work on. But yeah, I mean, I just wanted to add too. There's been a lot of business community support because of the benefit there is to people who are re-entering the community on the other end. 95% of people in prison are ultimately going to come out and come into the community, and I think they're best served, and I think the businesses recognize that they're best served by having these people come out with the greatest access to educational resources possible. So,
okay. That's good to know, because of course, if the education community and other communities support it, it shows that the bill is pretty much well-rounded and supported all the way around. And if people in education don't have a problem with it or are pushing for it, like, why are we what's the holdup? Anyways, so we did have a question about, for you, Gerald, again, DeJuan Maynard is someone you talked about on the FAMM site at some point. And we wanted to know, how did education play a role in his life, and how important was that for him?
So this is somebody that to try to describe just how good of a person he is, I don't think I would do it justice. But we came across one another. He was in my GED class, and he was very quiet. People have to understand, in prison, you practice antisocial behaviors. It's a survival mechanism. This is just how you, some people, this is just how you do your time. You keep to yourself. You watch your surroundings, you watch who you're around. And this is one of those people. I was kind of the same way. I have to kind of warm up to open myself up just a little bit. But he was very quiet, and he was in my class, and we had a talk about how important this was for him, because he was like, I don't even know if I want to do this just now. I have 25 years to do. I could do this, later on in my bid. And I said, why wait? I said, why wait? You're doing this time. So allow that to be surrounded, like allow this time to be about nothing but educating yourself, bettering yourself. Like, focus on that, and I promise you, you'll see dividends. And I don't know exactly what I said to him, but something I said, it clicked, and he took to it like I can't even describe. And he passed his GED the first. It might have been, he was in my class 2 months, and he passed his GED. And this is the new version of the GED. This is on the computer. So there's a significant difference from when he would do the paper and pencil to the computer version. It was a lot harder. It was a lot harder. I'll save that story for another day. And he had it. He had what I knew it took to pass. And from there, I think that he saw, or he realized that he had a lot more in him that he wanted to do. He didn't just want to sit around for this time. He had a lot more in him. So what he did was, what I did was I encouraged him to become a tutor with me, because I seen that he cared. And that's all it takes. It just takes for you to care a little bit to have a significant impact on a lot of these guys' lives. And at first he was telling me, like, he doesn't like talking to a lot of people. But I worked on him, and he became a tutor. And not only did he become a tutor, he took over my class when I left that particular institution, and he thrived. He thrived at this position, just like I did when I took it over. I hate to say it, but it's the truth. I realized my purpose when I was in prison. What I was put here to do. I was put here to educate, and that's the raw reality of it. I didn't want to be remembered by what got me to prison. This is not what I wanted to be remembered for. And I think that he felt the same way. So we took to this like our life depended on it. And I know that it changed him, because I still talk to him. I still have the ability to speak to him. And he tells me all the time that, it gave him purpose. He had a lot of time to do, but it gave him purpose. It gave him meaning. It gave him meaning to want to live, and to do better every day that he got up, to do better at his job and to try to educate these kids, because he knows how important it is. He knows that they're going back to society, and he doesn't, just like I didn't want them to go back thinking that they still had drug dealing or whatever as a viable option, because it's not. This is not a viable option. So we would stress that to them.
Okay, great. Josh, we have a question about, how does this Pell restoration fold into our second chance agenda? What's the connection between the two?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. As FAMM's second chance agenda, the framework is, a lot of that is about giving people a second chance to get their sentence looked at again, to have a second chance at sort of early release. But I think this does connect to that, because while there's not a direct early release mechanism tied to Pell grants, it it's a really key part, I think, for a lot of people who do have to go before the parole board and make a case for, here's how I've demonstrably changed since I've entered prison. Um, I know parole boards, or if you go before a judge to get a reexamination of your sentence, they're looking for real tangible evidence that you can point to before they want to let you out, before you max out your sentence, or if they want to adjust your sentence. And so being able to point to getting a college degree while you're in prison, that would be a huge deal. And so that would tie directly into kind of a lot of the second chance provisions that FAMM is going to be working on over the next, foreseeable future. And, another element of that too is just the practical aspect of, if you are able to get a second chance and get a second look at your sentence and get released earlier than you were initially expecting, this would equip people, a college education would equip people so much better to facilitate that transition if they are able to get out sooner.
Yes, awesome. So we are coming close to an end, and I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to provide some final thoughts and remarks, and to also give next steps for in the case of if there are next steps to give. So I want to start off with Gerald. Any closing remarks? Is there anything that you would like to say?
I thank you guys for doing this work. I encourage, just like I did in there, I encourage all of these young guys to figure out a better way other than what you may be living right now. And education is it. I know it sounds cliche, but it's the truth. Like, the more that you educate yourself, the better off that you'll be. I hope to do some teaching out here if I can, with non-traditional students if possible, because I can speak their language. I think I've said this before, I can speak their language. I figure out what it is that they need, and I try to teach to that, and I care. And a lot of times that's all that it takes. It doesn't take, rocket science to figure out, what these kids need. They just need somebody to show that they care a little bit. And you'll be surprised what you get. You never know. The next Einstein can be inside a prison, but you'll never know if you don't bring that up out of them. And I would see that time and again. There were very, very sharp kids that all it took was just a little bit of, okay, well, this is what it is. And I would just mash the gas on that one thing, because I knew that this is what they knew. So I would try to, help them blossom. I would try to bring it out of them, because sometimes it's tough, but sometimes, it's not that it's pretty easy. But you just have to have that want.
Mm-hmm. Heather?
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk about this issue. I'm really passionate about it and want to see it get done. And so I think in closing, I would just encourage those who are watching. There really is so much bipartisan support for this, but really the obstacle is fitting it somewhere, because Congress passes, in case you haven't noticed, so few bills. And so Josh mentioned, the appropriations process, like, we've got this standalone bill called the REAL Act, but really, we need to keep all options open, because oftentimes, Congress is going to move something big, and you got to get your issue into it. And so we just encourage you, FAMM's got great tools, and we certainly have tools at Prison Fellowship to reach out to your lawmakers. I know a lot of people feel sometimes like my voice doesn't matter. It does. Please continue contacting your lawmakers. And I'm also a big believer in culture changes law. So we also have to start with these conversations at our dinner tables. And if you're someone who attends a church, talk to people around you, and also get them mobilized to then talk to lawmakers, because lawmakers are really reflecting what they believe their constituents want. And so one tool I'll mention specific to Prison Fellowship that we'd love to offer you for free is called Outrageous Justice. It's a small group Bible study curriculum. If you're someone who's connected to a church and you'd like to use that to start these conversations, you can go to prisonfellowship.org. /outrageousjustice, and we'll send you free copies for you and your small group to use, or there's digital copies. We also have online groups for people to participate and talk. But let's keep this conversation going, not only with our friends and family and network, but with our lawmakers as well.
Absolutely. Josh?
Yeah, so, I want to say too, this was a great panel. I'm so glad I was able to participate and that Gerald and Heather were able to join us. Just some closing thoughts. I think, I don't know, we throw around the phrase common sense legislation a lot, but to me, this is one of the clearest examples of something that's just, it's common sense. And I think you can see that by, again, just sort of the breadth of people who support this, both bipartisan support as well as people from just different sectors of the world, the criminal justice world, the education world, the business world, who all really aggressively support this. I think there's a lot of data that shows why this is beneficial. It like dramatically increases the chances of employment for somebody who gets a college education and then returns to the community. There are studies showing there's a dramatic decrease in the rate of recidivism for people who are able to get a college education. But I also just think like it's really important because it's just the right thing to do. It's the opportunity to better yourself through education is kind of one of those fundamental elements of I think it's necessarily of just like human dignity. I think we hear stories just all the time from people who were able to get a college education or otherwise able to get some sort of educational opportunity in prison, and how that was, literally like transformative for them. So, and right now the educational opportunities are so inadequate. Like we have so many people who would be eligible for college programs, but like a tiny fraction actually have access. And just the last thing I want to add too is I think there's a racial justice engine to this as well. We know there's a huge opportunity gap when it comes to educational resources between people of color and white people, and so similarly with class, there's a huge opportunity gap for educational resources for lower class people and middle or upper class people. And then those gaps are reinforced and entrenched, reinforced and entrenched when you're then looking at a disproportionate number of people of color or poor people that are sent to prison, and it just sort of becomes a vicious cycle. So I think by returning Pell Grants to prison, that's also one common sense step we can take to kind of help disrupt that cycle, and kind of close that opportunity gap. So I don't know, I'm just thinking, it's fall, people are going back to school, and so as I see, family members and stuff heading back to school, I'm thinking about people in prison who have that thirst for knowledge that don't have that opportunity, but maybe we can return it to them.
Josh, do we have any actions that they can take? Sorry.
Thank you. No, thank you for reminding me. You can go to FAMM.org on our action page. We've got an action you can send to your senators about asking them to restore Pell in appropriations or with a real act. Somebody's probably posting it in the comments right now. If not, I'll come back and post it afterwards. But you can go to our website and find that as well.
Well, thank you all for joining us. This was a lovely panel. I hope to have you all back again for another edition of our discussion on education in prisons and also pushing for Pell. And that is all. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.